Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Such coordinates, time, place, presence, feel innocuous, even grounding. But in the worlds we're about to enter, those anchors dissolve. Location becomes spiral, time becomes refracted, and what once passed for selfhood begins to erode. Tonight, we examine two of the most unsettling works of 21st century horror, Junji Ito's Uzumaki and Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation. Works that, despite emerging from radically different cultures and aesthetic mediums, both echo a deeper, older tradition, one shaped not by jump scares or monsters, but by the creeping recognition that reality itself may not be structured for human comprehension. These are not merely modern horror texts. They are contemporary transmissions of a metaphysical virus first cultivated in the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, a form of cosmic horror that renders the self irrelevant, the world unreadable, and perception a liability. But unlike their literary ancestor, Uzumaki and Annihilation operate not through imitation, but through evolution. They absorb Lovecraft's epistemic anxiety and redirect it through new cultural lenses, one spiraling outward through Japanese folklore and post-bubble dread, the other unraveling through ecological uncertainty and post-human philosophy. Our investigation will move deliberately, through origins and influence, through themes and structure, through textual manifestations and cultural aftermaths. We will trace the pattern that binds spirals to landscapes, landscapes to madness, and madness to memory. By listening, you are already part of it. This is not a lecture, it is a recursion, and we are already inside. The uncanny resonance between Junji Ito's Uzumaki and Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation lies not simply in their thematic resemblance to Lovecraft's cosmic horror, but in their emergence from specific cultural ruptures, moments when the inherited logic of modernity faltered. These texts did not arise in isolation, nor were they intended as pastiches of early 20th century weird fiction. Instead, they represent localized philosophical responses to late 20th and early 21st century anxieties. Both Ito and Vandermeer found themselves creating under conditions marked by systemic uncertainty. For Ito, Japan's post-economic bubble stagnation and its resulting cultural disillusionment. For Vandermeer, a post-9/11 America reckoning with ecological devastation and institutional collapse. That their respective works echo Lovecraft is not evidence of direct lineage, but of recurrence, the return of cosmic horror not as genre, but as cultural symptom. Junji Ito began serializing Uzumaki in the manga magazine Big Comic Spirits in 1998, during what has been termed Japan's lost decade. Following the burst of the economic bubble in 1991, Japan entered a prolonged period of deflation, unemployment, and a generalized erosion of social optimism. Cultural analysts such as Hiroki Azuma have argued that this period gave rise to a new form of postmodern expression in Japan, one marked by database consumption, identity withdrawal, and affective numbness. Ito's work can be read as a Gothic response to this malaise, portraying a town not haunted by ghosts, but colonized by pattern. In Uzumaki, horror emerges not from transgression, but from repetition, the spiral that cannot be stopped, explained, or even meaningfully opposed. The spiral is not a metaphor for trauma. It is trauma's geometry. This reveals something profound. Ito does not write about fear. He writes about inevitability. Vandermeer's Annihilation, published in 2014, emerges from a different but equally destabilized context. Composed in the early 2010s, the novel reflects what has been called the ecological uncanny, a genre shift in which the environment itself becomes untrustworthy, sentient, or opaque. Scholars such as Timothy Morton have described this as the era of hyper-objects, phenomena so vast and distributed, like climate change or extinction, that they elude full human comprehension. Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy, and Annihilation in particular, is saturated with this sensibility. The story's central zone, Area X, is not evil, not monstrous, but simply indifferent to interpretation. The biologist, our unreliable narrator, enters the space not to defeat it or survive it, but to dissolve into it. The narrative is not a quest. It is a metamorphic document, a record of becoming unreadable. We must pause here. Vandermeer is not writing ecological horror in the traditional sense. He is writing cognitive ecology, where perception itself is subject to evolution. It is crucial to note that neither Ito nor Vandermeer self-identify as Lovecraftian in the traditional sense. In interviews, Ito has credited childhood exposure to ghost stories, Japanese folklore, and Kazuo Umezu's horror manga as more direct influences than any Western writer. Likewise, Vandermeer has cited Kafka, Ballard, and Blackwood as his major literary touchstones. And yet, both authors produce narratives governed by ontological instability, epistemic disintegration, and non-human scale, hallmarks of Lovecraft's cosmic horror. This is not mimicry, it is convergence. What emerges is a pattern wherein certain historical conditions, economic despair, ecological dread, post-human consciousness, produce similar literary architectures. The spiral in Uzumaki and Area X in Annihilation are not thematic references. They are symptoms of a deeper cultural recursion, one Lovecraft anticipated but did not complete. We must recognize that this convergence occurs not just in theme, but in narrative function. Both authors abandon conventional plot structure in favor of entropic progression. In Uzumaki, the town of Kuruzucho deteriorates chapter by chapter, its citizens increasingly warped by the spiral's influence. There is no mystery to solve, no enemy to defeat. Each episode is a further turn of the pattern, deeper into the spiral's unmaking. Similarly, in Annihilation, the biologists account fragments under the pressure of Area X's influence. Her journal becomes recursive, her body begins to change, and her voice slowly dissolves into the voice of the thing observing her. These are not character arcs. They are ontological reformatting processes, where the self is overwritten by an alien semiotics. This narrative strategy mirrors what Lovecraft attempted in stories like The Color Out of Space, 1927. But where Lovecraft gestured, Ito and Vandermeer complete the spiral. The question, then, is not whether Ito and Vandermeer intended to echo Lovecraft, but whether their worlds arise from the same cracks in perception. Both creators respond to historical moments in which systems, economic, ecological, epistemic, begin to fail. And in that failure, they locate not tragedy or protest, but transformation. Their protagonists do not resist the horror. They succumb to it, and in doing so, become something other. That surrender, terrible, intimate, irreversible, reframes horror not as an interruption, but as a revelation of structural truth. We must consider carefully. Perhaps these are not horror stories at all. Perhaps they are gospels of a new metaphysics, one in which consciousness is a temporary pattern within a greater recursion. As we move forward, our focus will shift from the immediate contexts of these authors to the cultural and philosophical antecedents that inform their works. The spiral and the anomalous zone are not inventions. They are rearticulations of older ideas, cosmic, religious, and esoteric, filtered through the lens of a collapsing modernity. To understand how these symbols operate, we must now look backward, not just to Lovecraft, but to Plato, to Shinto, to Gnosticism, and beyond. For in tracing the ancestry of these motifs, we may begin to grasp why they continue to recur, and why each return brings us closer to something we were not meant to see. Though Uzumaki and Annihilation appear as distinctly modern works, situated within late capitalist malaise and ecological anxiety, their terrors are not novel. Rather, they are contemporary manifestations of ideas that have haunted the human imagination for millennia. The spiral and the unknowable zone, though rendered here through manga and postmodern fiction, descend from ancient ontologies, religious cosmologies, metaphysical paradoxes, and esoteric systems that sought to explain what lay beyond human comprehension. These works, then, are not innovations but reactivations, transmissions of motifs that recur cyclically across cultures. The question is not why these images reappear, but why they have never truly left. To read Ito and Vandermeer in isolation is to misread them. They do not create mythologies, they inherit them. Consider first the spiral, Uzumaki's defining visual and metaphysical obsession. While the image of the spiral is now often aestheticized in pop culture, its historical weight is profound. From the megalithic petroglyphs of Neolithic Ireland to the uraeus coils on ancient Egyptian sarcophagi, the spiral has long been a symbol of cyclical time, birth and decay, and the continuity of life through transformation. In classical Greek thought, Plato's Timaeus described the soul of the cosmos as moving in spirals, an echo of divine geometries. In Hindu cosmology, the spiral-shaped kundalini is coiled at the base of the spine, a latent energy that, once awakened, uncoils through the body, transforming consciousness. In these systems, the spiral is not malevolent, but neither is it safe. It represents access to knowledge and states of being that destabilize identity, often irrevocably. Ito's use of the spiral as a force of madness, mutation, and obsession is not a perversion of this lineage. It is its radical fulfillment in a secular, post-ritual society. In Annihilation, Vandermeer eschews overt symbolism, yet the concept of territorial anomaly, a bounded zone where known laws dissolve, echoes traditions found across cultural and religious mythos. One may begin with Shinto, the indigenous spirituality of Japan, where boundaries between the human world and that of the kami, spirit beings, are fluid and unpredictable. Sacred groves, mist-covered shrines, and forgotten islands are not merely scenic. They are liminal spaces where exposure to the numinous is possible but dangerous. The forests of Annihilation, with their fungal blooms, refracted DNA, and perceptual distortions, mirror this structure. They are not evil. They are consecrated by their inaccessibility. Similarly, in Gnostic cosmology, the material world is a distorted reflection of divine reality, and salvation involves piercing through layers of illusion, often aided by secret knowledge or spiritual transformation. The biologist's slow disintegration of self and immersion into Area X constitutes not a descent into madness, but an inversion of Gnostic ascent. She does not escape the world, but is rewritten by it. We must recognize that the cultural antecedents at play here are not confined to myth and religion. They extend to the philosophical rupture points that have consistently undermined human-centric worldviews. In the Western canon, Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God did not simply reject religious belief. It dissolved the scaffolding upon which morality, knowledge, and purpose had been suspended. The spiral in Uzumaki and the transformations in Annihilation are not symbols of evil. They are voids where structure once stood. Likewise, Schopenhauer's vision of a blind, striving will behind all phenomena anticipates the unknowable agency of Vandermeer's Area X, an indifferent force that reconfigures life according to a logic beyond comprehension. And in Georges Bataille's theory of base materialism, the sacred is located not in the transcendent, but in the formless, the excreted, the decaying, precisely the realm into which Ito plunges his readers as flesh becomes spiral and spiral becomes flesh. At the core of these traditions lies a shared principle. To know is to endanger oneself. The pursuit of knowledge, spiritual, philosophical, or scientific, has always carried the threat of dissolution. In Uzumaki, characters attempt to study the spiral, photograph it, catalog its appearances. They are inevitably consumed by it. In Annihilation, the biologist's observational detachment gives way to embodiment. She becomes part of the zone she once mapped. This is a recurring warning, one found in Kabbalistic tradition, where improper engagement with divine mysteries can result in madness, in Greek tragedy, where hubris draws the gaze of the gods, and in Lovecraft's own mythos, where even a glance at forbidden texts alters the mind irrevocably. Ito and Vandermeer thus align themselves with a philosophy of forbidden thresholds, not in narrative gimmick, but in structural ethos. They do not warn against curiosity. They illustrate its cost. We must pause here to observe a critical inversion. In traditional religious systems, the dangerous knowledge one seeks often leads to transcendence, a new harmony, enlightenment, or reunification with the divine. But in Uzumaki and Annihilation, there is no transcendence, only transformation. No higher plane awaits, only a flattened continuity where human and non-human dissolve into one another. This marks a profound ontological shift. The spiral no longer leads upward, it coils inward. The zone is not a gate, it is a loop. In this, both works depart from the salvific logic of mystical traditions and embrace the non-teleological recursion of Lovecraft's cosmicism. The spiral is not a journey. It is a prison whose bars are made of pattern. Area X is not a trial to be survived. It is a new ontological baseline, one that renders survival an obsolete metric. And yet, these ancient motifs survive not because they offer answers, but because they mirror the questions we cannot stop asking. What lies beyond the visible? Can the self endure contact with the real? Is the world structured to be known, or merely to be endured? Ito and Vandermeer draw from myth, philosophy, and metaphysics not to provide clarity, but to reactivate dread, the kind that once accompanied the sacred, now attached to the inhuman. As we turn to examine the symbolic language they employ, the etymologies, shapes, and signifiers, we will begin to see how even the smallest visual cues encode these larger inheritances. For the spiral is not just a shape, and the name Area X is not just a placeholder. They are glyphs of recursion, and their interpretation may be the very thing that unravels us. Language is not merely a vessel of meaning in Uzumaki and Annihilation, it is a site of contamination. Words, names, and symbols are not stable. Tools for ordering the world, but fragile skins stretched over unknowable depths. The horror in both narratives is not only visual or conceptual, it is linguistic. The spiral and the X function not as symbols that point outward toward understanding, but as glyphs that loop back on themselves, endlessly deferring meaning. We must recognize these are not metaphors, they are semiotic traps. And the deeper one stares into them, the more language ceases to describe, and begins instead to reproduce the horror. Consider first the spiral, a shape that recurs obsessively in Uzumaki, not simply as an image, but as a semantic contagion. The term itself derives from the Latin spiralis, meaning coil, which in turn comes from spira, a winding or curve. But the root verb spirare means to breathe. Thus, the spiral in its etymological ancestry is not merely a form, it is a living motion, a vital cycle. It denotes not just geometry, but respiration, consciousness, and spiritual force. The same root gives us spirit, inspire, and expire. Ito's use of the spiral thus reactivates a buried dimension. By showing the spiral as the mechanism of transformation, he literalizes what ancient linguistics encoded. The spiral does not merely kill, it inhalates the soul, and in this, its horror is not arbitrary. It is ontologically correct. The spiral's evolution from sacred pattern to horror icon is not unique to Ito, but in Uzumaki, he makes a deliberate choice to embed the spiral into every level of signification. It is not merely an image, it becomes the shape of snails, the curve of a lover's ear, the whirls in smoke, the trajectory of a storm. In one of the most chilling chapters, a pregnant woman craves spiral-shaped food. Her unborn child becomes malformed. In another, a girl's hair begins to grow into spirals, consuming her body. The spiral becomes not just a curse, but a language of becoming, a way the world speaks itself into new, grotesque configurations. The key is repetition. Each occurrence is a semantic iteration, reinforcing the spiral's dominion over sense. It is not symbolic of madness. It is madness as semiotic recursion. One cannot resist it, because it is not outside the self. It is inside the syntax. Annihilation uses different linguistic tactics, but the effect is equally destabilizing. The central anomaly is named Area X, a designation that refuses signification even as it demands interpretation. The X is not a name. It is an anti-name, a symbol of negation, of the unknown, of absence in the shape of presence. In algebra, X denotes the variable, the thing to be solved. In cartography, X marks the spot, the site of buried treasure or forbidden entry. In genetics, the X chromosome determines biology and difference. And in literature, X signals redaction, erasure, censorship. Vandermeer collapses these connotations into one glyph, which, like Ito's spiral, functions as linguistic opacity, form that refuses to stabilize meaning. Consider carefully. The act of calling it Area X ensures its unknowability. It is not what lies beyond language. It is what weaponizes language against itself. The biologist's narrative is itself riddled with linguistic ambiguity. The expedition members are never named, only designated by role: the surveyor, the psychologist, the biologist. This act of nominative reduction is not just bureaucratic, it is metaphysical. Without names, these individuals lose internal cohesion. They become types, fragments of procedural language inhabiting a space where identity no longer functions. This echoes the linguistic erasures of mystic traditions, where the true names of gods are hidden or unpronounceable. And to speak a thing's name is to exercise power over it. In Annihilation, that power has been revoked. Language has decoupled from referent. When the biologist reads the words etched on the wall of the tower, "Where lies the strangling fruit that came from the hand of the sinner? I shall bring forth the seeds of the dead, to share with the worms that gather in the darkness and surround the world with the power of their lives, while from the dim-lit halls of other places forms, that never were and never could be writhe for the impatience of the few who never saw what could have been." She is not encountering knowledge. She is encountering syntax without anchor. Meaning does not emerge. Meaning decays. We must pause here and draw a parallel to Lovecraft's own linguistic maneuvers. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, he describes the dread name Cthulhu as a guttural syllable, utterly unhuman, and insists it can never be truly spoken. In The Dunwich Horror, 1929, the Necronomicon is filled with incantations that corrupt the mind. Lovecraft's invention of alien phonemes, Ar-Lie, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth, was not just for atmospheric effect. It was an assertion that some knowledge exists beyond phonetic capture. Ito and Vandermeer inherit this tradition, but rather than invent new tongues, they corrupt familiar ones. The spiral, the X, the unnameable glyph, they all function as implosions of meaning, as signs that signal their own insufficiency. This reveals something profound. The horror in these texts is not content-based. It is structural. The terror lies in the moment when the reader realizes that the symbols being presented are not designed to be understood. They are not puzzles to solve. They are machines that replicate confusion. Like Zen koans, they short-circuit rational interpretation, not to enlighten, but to unmoor. And this is where the spiral and the X become not merely dangerous, but contagious. The more they are seen, the more they are thought. The more they are thought, the more they replicate. This is not narrative escalation. It is semiotic infection. The power of Uzumaki and Annihilation lies not solely in their aesthetics of decay or metaphysical unease, but in their capacity to simulate belief systems. These are not merely horror narratives. They are self-enclosed mythologies, constructed to feel as though they predate their creators. The dread they evoke stems less from individual events than from the implication of deep time, a narrative logic that suggests the reader is encountering not invention, but revelation. Consider carefully. When a story begins to feel older than itself, when its logic appears discovered rather than written, it ceases to be merely fiction. It becomes cosmology. Both Ito and Vandermeer achieve this by employing what might be termed narrative erosion, the deliberate degradation of explanatory structure, whereby what remains are fragments, documents, and obsessive testimonies. This mimics not plot, but scripture. In Uzumaki, the mythic quality of the spiral emerges through episodic accumulation, not exposition. The story is serialized in chapters that mimic folk legends. Each entry recounts a new manifestation of the spiral, its influence on human bodies, architecture, weather, memory. There is no central antagonist, no final explanation. Instead, the town of Kuruzucho becomes a microcosm for non-linear mythology, a site where the curse is both ancient and ongoing. Like the folkloric structures studied by Vladimir Propp or Claude Lévi-Strauss, Uzumaki operates via ritual repetition. Each chapter reaffirms the spiral's power, even as it provides no clear causal origin. We are told that the spiral has always existed, that it reemerges in cycles, that it consumes civilizations. This timeless quality is not revealed through lore, but through pattern recognition. The reader becomes a participant in mythic recursion, not by acquiring knowledge, but by surrendering to the inevitability of narrative repetition. Junji Ito reinforces this mythic realism by portraying his narrator, Kiri, not as a protagonist in the heroic sense, but as a testifier, a witness whose role is less to act than to record. She is not especially skilled, brave, or unique. Her survival is not triumph. It is endurance through narration. This strategy echoes the testimonial voices found in ancient apocalyptic literature, the seer, the scribe, the last survivor, whose visions are not explanations, but warnings. The final chapter of Uzumaki, in which the town is subsumed by spiral architecture and its residents fuse into an eternal spiral city, offers no climax in the traditional sense. There is no catharsis, only entombment within symbol. The spiral wins not because it defeats the characters, but because it completes them. The narrative itself loops, an eternal return with no exit. In this way, Uzumaki resembles not a novel, but a local curse codex, passed between generations without resolution. Vandermeer's Annihilation constructs myth through a different mechanism: the documentary fragment. The novel's form is explicitly that of a journal, the biologist's field notes collected after the fact. There is no omniscient narrator, no comprehensive map of Area X. Information is partial, distorted, and often contradictory. This mirrors the archival horror found in Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, or At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, where knowledge is mediated through unreliable manuscripts. But Vandermeer pushes further by embedding layers of narrative bureaucracy: the Southern Reach Organization, redacted reports, deleted expeditions. The result is a palimpsest of failed interpretations. The reader is not given a story, they are given a textual excavation, and must navigate through it without guideposts. This simulates the experience of encountering a recovered mythology, one that has outlived its own coherence. The myth of Area X is reinforced by its resistance to typology. It is not an alien invasion, not a cursed land, not a dreamscape. It is all of these and none. Vandermeer denies classification, offering instead intersecting systems of reference: environmental collapse, psychological mutation, post-human transcendence. In doing so, he mirrors the ambiguous sacredness of zones found in Gnostic texts, Kabbalistic cosmology, and Shinto mysticism. Like the Pleroma or the Kami no Michi, Area X is holy, not because it is moral, but because it is incommensurate with the profane world. Its mythness derives from this very refusal to be known. The reader, like the biologist, cannot resolve what Area X is. They can only experience what it does to those who enter. And it is this act of transformation, recorded obsessively, that builds belief. We must recognize that both Uzumaki and Annihilation function as belief engines not by presenting coherent cosmologies, but by modeling the cognitive dissolution that belief often demands. There is no origin myth that explains the spiral. There is no creation story for Area X. Instead, there are recurrences, anomalies, and patterns of erasure. This reflects the way real-world mythologies often behave, not as orderly narratives, but as contradictory accumulations of meaning that defy synthesis. These stories infect the reader not by inviting agreement, but by dislodging rational expectation. The effect is cumulative, insidious, and deeply effective. One finishes these works not with answers, but with a lingering suspicion that something important has shifted, in the world, in the self, or in the logic that separates the two. To understand why Uzumaki and Annihilation function as modern inheritors of Lovecraftian terror, we must first confront the philosophical engine beneath their surface. These texts do not merely terrify through plot or spectacle. They disturb through conceptual architecture. Their horror is not aesthetic, but ontological. Both Ito and Vandermeer construct narratives that operate according to three interwoven principles: the insignificance of the self, the inevitability of entropy, and the collapse of the boundary between dream and reality. These are not themes in the literary sense. They are cosmic conditions, metaphysical truths presented as environments. And once the reader enters these conditions, narrative meaning, character agency, and even perception begin to degrade. The first and most foundational concept is insignificance, not moral or social, but cosmic insignificance. In Lovecraft's mythos, the horror stems from the realization that humanity occupies no central role in the universe, that the cosmos is vast, indifferent, and fundamentally unknowable. Ito and Vandermeer update this idea for their respective cultural moments. In Uzumaki, human beings are not just incidental, they are raw material for the spiral's endless recursion. Characters are warped, stretched, and dissolved without reason or malice. The spiral does not punish, it simply proceeds. In one chapter, a couple merges into a single, coiling mass after attempting to elope. Their love story, tender and desperate, is subsumed into a pattern that has no need for love or story. This is not simply death, it is narrative irrelevance. Vandermeer's Annihilation similarly displaces the human. The biologist is not chosen by Area X, she is refracted by it. Her internal monologue begins to loop. Her observations become increasingly nonlinear, and by the novel's end, her voice dissolves into the structure she once sought to describe. The terror here is not being noticed by the other. It is the dawning certainty that the other does not notice at all. We must pause here to acknowledge a subtle shift. Lovecraft's insignificance is epistemic, the horror of being unable to know. In Ito and Vandermeer, insignificance becomes ontological, the horror of not mattering even when one does know. This reframes the function of knowledge entirely. The second concept, entropy, reinforces this. In both texts, reality itself is presented as an entropic system, not decaying randomly, but decaying according to an illegible logic. In Uzumaki, this is dramatized spatially. The town of Kuruzucho physically bends into a spiral, its streets and buildings warping over time. Matter does not break down, it reorganizes. The horror lies in the fact that this reorganization is not reversible. It is irreversible structuring, a final form that unforms everything else. In Annihilation, entropy manifests biologically and cognitively. DNA splices, thought patterns duplicate. The biologist's body becomes host to something fungal, something luminous, something that remembers her differently. Vandermeer's prose itself reflects this entropy. Sentences double back on themselves, time slips, memory fractures. There is no linear decline, there is only recursive mutation. This reveals something profound. Both authors suggest that entropy is not absence of order, but presence of alien order. The spiral is not chaos, it is excessive form. Area X is not void, it is overcoded reality. This is a reversal of classical horror, where chaos threatens to intrude upon the structured world. In Uzumaki and Annihilation, it is structure that becomes horrifying. The spiral always spirals, the zone always zones. Their logic is relentless, complete, and incompatible with human survival. And yet, it is not malevolent, it is systemic. This aligns with contemporary philosophical currents such as object-oriented ontology and speculative realism, which posit that objects, systems, and patterns exist with their own internal coherence, independent of human access or interpretation. The spiral and Area X do not haunt the human world. They continue despite it. A third and final principle emerges from this framework: the collapse of dream and reality, or, more accurately, the realization that there was never a boundary between the two. Lovecraft often explored this in stories such as The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadoth, 1927, where dreams bleed into waking life and vice versa. Vandermeer and Ito translate this metaphysical instability into narrative form. In Uzumaki, characters frequently question whether events are real, but their questioning is never resolved. The spiral reshapes not only bodies and towns, but perception itself. In one scene, people begin to hide in narrow spaces, contorting their bodies to avoid spirals, only to realize the hiding itself forms a spiral. They are caught in a dream logic loop, a recursive trap, where intention and environment are indistinguishable. Annihilation intensifies this collapse. Area X is dreamlike not because it is surreal, but because it is hyperreal, too coherent, too detailed, too attentive. The biologist experiences hallucinations, but cannot separate them from physical reality. She sees light without source, hears echoes of her own thoughts spoken by plants, and eventually comes to believe that she may have died and been replaced by a copy. The dream is not an escape. It is a simulation indistinguishable from the real, and it is expanding. This collapse of dream and reality destabilizes the narrative itself. Neither Uzumaki nor Annihilation offers reliable chronology, singular perspective, or narrative closure. Their worlds do not respond to interpretation, they absorb it. The spiral repeats regardless of what is said about it. Area X continues to grow, indifferent to classification. This creates a philosophical impasse. If reality cannot be distinguished from hallucination, and if both operate according to alien logics, then the very project of understanding becomes suspect. This is the final horror. Not that the world is unknowable, but that knowing changes nothing. This is not postmodern cynicism. It is metaphysical horror, drawn from the tradition of thinkers like Emile Cioran, who wrote that lucidity is the wound closest to the sun. In Uzumaki and Annihilation, lucidity reveals pattern, and pattern reveals irrelevance. And yet, we continue to read, to interpret, to search for significance within insignificance. This recursive impulse, the refusal to look away from, the spiral, the urge to re-enter the zone, suggests something deeper. Perhaps we are drawn not to terror, but to recognition. These texts do not invent horror. They articulate something already intuited. That reality may be structured according to patterns we were not designed to perceive. And that contact with those patterns does not liberate, but unravels. In this way, Uzumaki and Annihilation do not merely echo Lovecraft. They fulfill his premise. They construct spaces where core philosophical concepts, insignificance, entropy, dream reality, are not discussed. They are lived. Traditional horror fiction often anchors its dread in the figure of a monster, an entity with boundaries, intentions, and narrative function. Yet, in Uzumaki and Annihilation, the horror emerges not from monsters, but from systems misperceived as entities. There are no gods, no antagonists, no supernatural intruders in the conventional sense. Instead, there are forces, ambient, impersonal, and all-consuming, whose behavior mimics sentience while remaining ontologically alien. These forces are not characters within the story. They are conditions of the story's universe. To invoke Lovecraftian terms, they are not simply analogues to the old ones. They are distributed intelligences, patterns of transformation that render individuality obsolete. And in both works, the horror lies not in contact with these forces, but in the slow realization that one has already been absorbed. In Uzumaki, the spiral functions not as a symbol, but as a non-human actor, a force that possesses agency without volition. There is no spiral god, no cursed object, no central intelligence behind the madness, and yet, the spiral exhibits behavior. It recurs, adapts, inhabits, replicates. It infects matter and memory, manipulating biology and architecture. Characters become snail-like, their bodies elongating into whorled grotesqueries. Smoke from crematoriums swirls unnaturally. Even sound begins to echo in spirals. This ubiquity suggests not randomness, but design. Not from a mind, but from a form itself acting as law. It is not a being in the Lovecraftian sense of Nyarlathotep or Cthulhu, but it behaves like one. The spiral observes no morality, no plan, no malice. It is not a god. It is not a curse. It is a syntax that rewrites everything it touches. Vandermeer's Annihilation presents a parallel structure. The shimmer of Area X is not an entity, but it behaves like one. It reproduces, mutates, consumes, and communicates obliquely through biological inscription. In Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space, 1927, a nameless alien force arrives on a meteorite and slowly warps the surrounding ecosystem. Vandermeer's shimmer operates with the same logic, but scaled to encompass not just terrain, but consciousness itself. The biologist becomes aware that she is being seen, but this observation does not follow the logic of predator and prey. Rather, she is being mapped, mirrored, rewritten. Area X leaves no corpses. It leaves reproductions, duplicates, echoes, simulations. This echoes the logic of Lovecraft's dreamlands, where travelers sometimes return altered, not knowing what part of them remains authentic. Area X is not an organism. It is not even an intelligence. It is a condition into which minds dissolve. We must recognize that these forces problematize our very definition of life. The spiral in Uzumaki is a geometrical imperative that hijacks biological systems. Area X is an ecological singularity that operates like a hybrid of virus and deity. Both lack goals, but both produce effects that mimic intention. This is a form of horror articulated in speculative biology and systems theory, what philosopher Timothy Morton terms the strange stranger, that which is intimate yet unknowable, proximal yet unreachable. The spiral and the shimmer are not enemies. They are autonomous ontologies, operating alongside ours until the moment of intersection. And that intersection, once it occurs, cannot be reversed. In this light, the transformations endured by characters in both works take on new meaning. They are not victims of possession or corruption. They are recoded. In Uzumaki, bodies become spirals. Memories fragment into recursive loops. In Annihilation, the biologist begins to glow, her cells transcribed with incomprehensible text. These are not punishments. They are assimilation events. The horror is not in becoming other. The horror is in realizing that otherness was always the substrate. Here we find the darkest echo of Lovecraft's cosmicism. Not that the gods are hostile, but that we were never distinct from them to begin with. The force is not external. It is the hidden shape of the real. Consider carefully the religious implications. In most theologies, to encounter a god is to risk transformation. Moses' face is transfigured by divine light. The mystic loses their ego to divine union. But in Uzumaki and Annihilation, the divine is non-theistic. There is no will, no message, no salvation. The spiral does not punish, it iterates. Area X does not test, it remakes. This places these texts in alignment not with organized religion, but with apophatic mysticism, the negative theology of silence, where the divine is defined only by what it is not. The spiral is not a being. Area X is not alive. But in their relentless patterning, they perform the function of gods. They create, they destroy, they transcend human comprehension. In this way, they fulfill the role of Lovecraft's old ones, deities without doctrine, beings whose mere presence obliterates sanity. We must pause here and acknowledge a final inversion. In Lovecraft's work, contact with the old ones is externalized, a ritual, an awakening, a descent. In Uzumaki and Annihilation, contact is gradual and internal. It is not the monster that breaks the door. It is the pattern that rearranges the room until the door no longer exists. These are soft, ontological horrors, slow, intimate, inescapable. You do not flee from the spiral, you draw it. You do not escape Area X. You narrate it until your words become its own. The boundary between human and inhuman is not broken, it is redesigned, and so we must ask, if these forces are not beings, not symbols, not metaphors, what are they? Perhaps they are best understood as vectors, carriers of new logics, new realities, new forms of being. They are not the threat, they are the future arriving uninvited, and those who encounter them do not die. They become conduits. In this, Ito and Vandermeer move beyond Lovecraft. They do not depict gods that destroy, they depict patterns that overwrite. In Uzumaki and Annihilation, human characters do not merely witness horrors, they are consumed by them, psychologically and physiologically. Yet this consumption is not sudden, nor is it conventionally violent. It unfolds gradually as the structures that define identity, memory, perception, intention, are eroded by contact with alien systems of logic. The response to this contact is what we, from a human-centered worldview, label madness. But these works do not depict madness as dysfunction or as temporary delusion. Rather, madness is rendered as ontological incompatibility, a symptom of interface with forces that do not obey human epistemologies. These are not stories of people going insane. These are case studies in consciousness encountering its own redundancy. In Uzumaki, madness manifests as obsessive behavior, physical deformation, and ultimately identity erasure. The townspeople of Kuruzuchu do not simply become afraid of spirals. They begin to act in accordance with the spiral's logic. They hide in tight spaces, twist their bodies unnaturally, cut off parts of themselves that spiral involuntarily. This is not fear, it is participation. Over time, even those who resist begin to mirror the spiral. One woman believes her hair is trying to strangle her. A man insists his body must coil to remain safe. These are not irrational beliefs in the conventional sense. They are hyper-rational within a newly emergent reality. The spiral warps cognition, not by direct psychic assault, but by making its logic unavoidable. Thought loops become spatial loops. Behavior mimics geometry. Mind succumbs to pattern. The biologist in Annihilation undergoes a parallel transformation, though hers is more internalized and introspective. Initially a scientist committed to objective observation, she slowly becomes unmoored from her own subjectivity. She stops trusting her memories, then her perceptions, then even her motivations. When she speaks, her voice echoes with alien inflection. Her dreams become indistinguishable from experience. But crucially, this does not produce terror in her. It produces a strange serenity. She notes that her fear fades as she changes. "I didn't feel invaded," she writes. "I felt opened." This reframes madness as a shedding of ontological boundaries. She is not broken, she is rewritten, not by coercion, but by alignment with something vast and unknowable. Like the townspeople of Kuruzucho, her descent into madness is indistinguishable from adaptation. We must recognize that in both narratives, madness is not depicted as individual pathology, but as environmental inevitability. It is the default human response to cognitive contact with alien systems. In this, Ito and Vandermeer echo Lovecraft's dictum from The Call of Cthulhu, 1928. The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. But whereas Lovecraft's characters often go mad from sudden revelations, the sight of a god, the reading of a forbidden text, Ito and Vandermeer present madness as slow epistemic erosion. There is no single moment of rupture. There is only accumulation of incompatibility until the mind reconfigures or collapses. This suggests a deeper horror, not that madness is rare, but that sanity is provisional, a temporary equilibrium between the human self and a universe not built to accommodate it. Philosophically, this aligns with thinkers like Michel Foucault, who argued that madness is a category imposed by dominant systems of rationality, and with Gilles Deleuze, who proposed that subjectivity is not fixed but continually shaped by forces, flows, and intensities. In Uzumaki, the spiral is precisely such a force, not external but immanent, a structuring presence that rewrites cognition through spatial and temporal recursion. In Annihilation, Area X exerts a similar function, not as a landscape to be navigated, but as a consciousness field that reframes the subject. These are not places where madness happens. These are topologies of madness, spaces whose laws are incompatible with the structures that sustain identity. This reveals something profound. The boundary between madness and enlightenment begins to blur. The characters who resist the spiral or the shimmer often perish. Those who accept transformation endure, but at the cost of their prior selves. Kiri, the narrator of Uzumaki, survives to the end not because she escapes, but because she becomes the chronicler of the spiral's completion. The biologist endures by yielding to the process, allowing herself to be rewritten by Area X. In both cases, survival is reframed as metamorphosis through madness. There is no restoration, no return to normalcy. These stories do not end with the closing of a gate, but with the closure of human identity itself. We must pause here to consider a disturbing possibility. What if madness, as depicted in these texts, is not a failure of the mind, but its awakening to the real? What if the spiral and the shimmer do not drive people mad, but reveal that sanity was always a fragile fiction maintained by limited perception? This would mean that the mad are not broken, but simply further along in the process of ontological recognition. Madness becomes not a collapse, but a pivot, a turning of the self toward the inhuman. This is not redemption, it is recalibration. If the first terror of cosmic horror is insignificance, and the second is transformation, then the final and most intimate terror is epistemic collapse, the disintegration of knowing itself. In Uzumaki and Annihilation, knowledge is not a weapon or salvation. It is a contagion, a corrosive insight that alters the structures of thought. These are not cautionary tales about forbidden information in the sense of secret spells or esoteric truths. They are narratives about what happens when the act of knowing becomes indistinguishable from the act of destruction. And what collapses is not only the mind, but the very categories by which the mind organizes the world. Lovecraft's work famously revolves around this idea. The Necronomicon does not merely contain dangerous truths. It contains truths that unmake the reader. Characters who glimpse the cosmic order often retreat into silence or madness, as in The Whisperer in Darkness or The Dreams in the Witch House. But Ito and Vandermeer update this model by embedding epistemic collapse within the narrative itself. In Uzumaki, the more Kiri and those around her learn about the spiral, its manifestations, its history, its recurrence, the less coherent their world becomes. They begin to map the town, only to discover it has curved into a giant vortex. They investigate a building's structure, only to be swallowed by its internal spiral. What they learn does not clarify. It accelerates collapse. The spiral is not a symbol. It is a knowing without boundary, a knowledge that expands faster than cognition can absorb it. Annihilation structures this collapse differently, but no less devastatingly. The biologist begins her journey with the tools of scientific inquiry: observation, classification, hypothesis. Yet each attempt at understanding Area X results in further disorientation. She dissects a creature and finds it mirrors her DNA. She reads inscriptions that repeat without variation. She journals to make sense of her surroundings, but the text folds in on itself. We must pause here to observe a narrative irony. Her process of inquiry mimics our own as readers, and her failure mirrors our own interpretive futility. The more she understands, the less stable her voice becomes. The narration does not simply document collapse, it performs it. This metatextual recursion evokes Borges's The Library of Babel, where infinite knowledge generates infinite confusion. In Area X, the text is the territory, and the reader is already infected. We must recognize the profound implication. Knowledge in these works is not dangerous because of its content, but because of its form. The spiral is not horrific because of what it reveals, but because it never stops revealing. It is an infinite regress. Area X is not terrible because of what it contains, but because it contains everything, and thus nullifies differentiation. This aligns with the philosophical concept of hyperobjects, entities so vast in temporal or spatial scale that they cannot be fully grasped. Climate change, capital, extinction, all contemporary hyperobjects behave like the spiral, or Area X, partially knowable, endlessly expanding, and deeply destabilizing. These fictions reveal a deep truth. We do not fear knowledge itself, but the loss of mastery it implies. This is why the spiral and the shimmer are so insidious. They do not destroy the mind directly. They destroy the preconditions for intelligibility. In Uzumaki, language begins to fail. The townspeople no longer remember directions, names, or seasons. The world loops, and so does speech. In Annihilation, the biologist loses track of time and sequence. She reads the same sentence again and again, not because she is confused, but because the world no longer changes. This is not ignorance. It is a saturation of knowing that unhooks time from progression and mind from cohesion. This echoes Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time, where the protagonist learns too much and becomes estranged from the flow of history itself. To know too much in this tradition is to become temporally misplaced, to occupy a point in thought that can no longer be located in human duration. Consider carefully the religious undertone. Classical Gnostic texts warn against the full apprehension of divine truth, which blinds rather than enlightens. In the Gospel of Thomas, it is said, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." But such knowledge is not life-giving. It is annihilating. To know is to exit the cycle. Vandermeer and Ito invert this premise. To know is not to transcend, but to spiral inward, to encounter recursion so pure it devours interpretation. Their characters are not saved by truth. They are hollowed out by it, and what remains is not wisdom, but formless repetition. The very image of epistemic entropy. This reveals something profound. The modern horror of knowledge is not that we cannot know, but that we might know everything, and it still wouldn't save us. The biologist discovers the shimmer's secrets, but they change nothing. Curie witnesses the spiral's final form, but it only completes the pattern. There is no forbidden tome to close, no spell to forget. These are non-negotiable realities. They do not wait to be deciphered, they proceed. And the mind, faced with that inevitability, ceases to function as it once did. Epistemic collapse is not failure. It is transformation into a new ontological grammar. In this light, madness and knowledge become indistinguishable. What we call insanity is merely the mind reconfiguring itself around a logic it was never evolved to hold. Lovecraft's protagonists go mad from glimpses. Vandermeer and Ito's go mad from saturation. There is no outside the spiral. There is no exit from Area X. The horror is not of what lies beyond, but of realizing there is no beyond at all, only deeper iterations of the same unknowable structure. To trace the lineage of Uzumaki and Annihilation is to enter a literary labyrinth where motifs, fears, and ontological inquiries echo across time. These works did not emerge from cultural vacuum. Rather, they represent mutated culminations of prior textual strains, texts that, while seemingly unconnected, share an aesthetic of disruption, a logic of recursion, and a suspicion of coherent reality. What Junji Ito and Jeff Vandermeer have constructed are not homages in the superficial sense, but evolutions of inherited myth structures. And these myth structures originate not in horror per se, but in traditions that treated perception, memory, and form as inherently unstable. Uzumaki, serialized between 1998 and 1999, appears at first glance to be rooted in contemporary Japanese horror, a genre marked by its focus on spatial anxiety, generational trauma, and technological intrusion. Yet the deeper textual ancestry of Uzumaki is far older and broader. The spiral, as both visual and metaphysical symbol, appears in the prehistoric petroglyphs of Malta, in the labyrinthine coils of Greek meander patterns, and in the mandalas of Tibetan Buddhism. Its recurrence across cultures suggests not a symbol, but a universal cognitive attractor, a shape so deeply embedded in human perception that it bypasses interpretation and provokes response. In literature, we see proto-spiral thinking in Dante's Inferno, 1320, where hell is not a space, but a descending spiral of moral deformation. The deeper one travels, the more human categories collapse. Ito's Kuruzucho operates similarly, each chapter descending into another coil of inexplicable mutation, another violation of form. Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, 2014, though published nearly 15 years later, enters the spiral from the opposite end, not mythic descent, but ecological recursion. His direct influences include J.G. Ballard, Daphne du Maurier, and most explicitly, the 1972 novel Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. In Roadside Picnic, a mysterious alien visitation leaves behind a contaminated zone where physics no longer behave properly, and human attempts at comprehension are futile. Vandermeer explicitly acknowledges this lineage, but Area X is more than homage. It is the zone naturalized, reinterpreted through the lens of environmental collapse and post-human theory. Where the Strugatskys treat the zone as residue, Vandermeer treats it as incipient ontology. Not what is left behind, but what is emerging. The shimmer is not inert. It is active recursion, consuming and replacing. We must recognize a key intertextual hinge. Both Uzumaki and Annihilation draw not just from horror or science fiction, but from a broader modernist anxiety about representation. In Ulysses, 1922, James Joyce fractures narrative time. In The Wasteland, 1922, T.S. Eliot dissolves coherence through cultural detritus. Vandermeer's narrative structure, with its fragmented timelines and unreliable documents, reflects this lineage. Likewise, Ito's episodic structure mirrors not only Japanese manga serialization, but also the uncanny modularity of Kafka's parables, where repetition replaces resolution. Both authors place their readers in the position of the epistemically destabilized subject, searching for meaning in texts that actively resist synthesis. Consider also the role of Lovecraft, not as origin, but as conduit. His work refracts earlier romantic terrors, e.g., Poe's obsession with doubles, Shelley's Sublime, through the metaphysics of 20th century nihilism. But unlike Lovecraft's mythos, where named gods anchor the madness, Ito and Vandermeer refuse iconography. There is no Cthulhu in Uzumaki, no Yog-Sothoth in Annihilation. Their entities are patterns, shapes, zones, forces that cannot be named because they do not operate in narrative space. They operate in form space. Vandermeer's shimmer reflects this shift. It has no face, no origin, no declared intent. Like Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space, 1927, it is a presence that warps everything without ever declaring itself. Yet while Lovecraft often reveals the horror through forbidden manuscripts or arcane rites, Vandermeer withholds even that. The documents in Annihilation contradict each other. The Southern Reach cannot interpret what it collects. The Shimmer writes its own data, and it is unreadable. We must pause here and consider the spiral and the zone as narrative viruses, mimetic structures that infect texts as much as characters. The spiral reappears in Ito's earlier short works, such as The Enigma of Amigara Fault, 2001, where people discover holes shaped precisely like their bodies and are compelled to enter them. Though not directly connected to Uzumaki, this story repeats its logic. Pattern recognition leads to self-annihilation. Similarly, Vandermeer's earlier fiction, such as his ambergris stories, features underground fungi, altered maps, and unreliable narrators. These are not prequels, they are infection vectors, testing the structure before the full outbreak of annihilation. In this way, both authors treat their literary careers as gradual intrusions by alien logic, preparing the ground for the total narrative recursion that defines their major works. The implication is clear. Uzumaki and Annihilation are not standalone phenomena. They are apexes of a deeper pattern, a pattern that begins with ancient symbols, mutates through literary modernism, absorbs Lovecraftian dread, and re-emerges in the late 20th and early 21st centuries under the sign of epistemic infection. They represent not just stories, but thresholds, texts that mark the moment when horror ceases to be about what lies beyond, and becomes about what has always structured the real. To study Uzumaki in its entirety is to confront a narrative that behaves not like a novel, but like an infection vector, a work structured by accumulation, escalation, and terminal collapse. Serialized between 1998 and 1999 in Big Comic Spirits, Junji Ito's magnum opus spans 20 chapters and an epilogue, each of which incrementally escalates the spiral motif from local anomaly to cosmic structuring principle. The story follows high school student Kiri Goshima and her boyfriend Shuichi Saito as they witness their hometown, Kuruzucho, fall under the increasingly surreal influence of spirals. Yet the true protagonist of Uzumaki is not Kiri nor Shuichi. It is the spiral itself, which moves from background motif to world-ordering force, asserting its logic over architecture, biology, psychology, and time. The early chapters introduce the spiral subtly. In The Spiral Obsession, Shuichi's father develops a fixation with spiral patterns, collecting snail shells, turning his body into a vortex during contortions, and eventually curling into a barrel to die by compressing himself into a spiral. His mother, horrified, develops a spiral phobia and gouges out her inner ears to eliminate the shape of the cochlea. The pattern here is clear. The spiral's power is not symbolic, but somatic and semiotic. It distorts not only space, but the body's relationship to space. We must pause to recognize that the narrative's horror does not emerge from these events alone, but from their inexplicability. There is no cause, no origin, no punishment. The spiral simply appears, and the town begins to change. As the serialization progresses, the spiral's influence becomes increasingly systemic. In The Snail, students transform into gastropods during rainstorms, their movements slowing, their minds dissolving. In Medusa, Kiri's hair rebels against her will, growing into a mass of coiling tendrils that attempt to outgrow arrivals. By the midpoint of the series, spatial logic breaks down entirely. Streets loop endlessly, houses bend into themselves. In the chapter Mosquitoes, newborn mothers become insectoid predators, compelled to extract spiral-shaped nutrients from human blood. These examples are not disconnected body horror vignettes. They form an epidemic morphology, each chapter illustrating a new site of invasion, a new domain of life overrun by the spiral's recursive logic. The story spirals not only in content, but in structure, repeatedly circling back to Kiri as a static observer, anchoring the reader in a decaying frame. The narrative's tone is equally significant. Unlike Western horror, which often oscillates between terror and catharsis, Uzumaki offers no release, no climax, and no resistance. Characters do not fight the spiral. They adapt, succumb, or vanish. Shuichi, who initially tries to warn others, becomes increasingly detached and spectral, as though already halfway into another form. Kiri remains a passive observer, not out of cowardice, but because agency is meaningless in a world governed by shape. In Dechi, the final chapters, the entire town collapses into a literal spiral pit. with the architecture forming concentric underground chambers. Time dilates, light refracts. People settle into niches like fossils awaiting compression. And finally, in the epilogue, Kiri and Shuichi lie together, their bodies twisted into a single double helix, awaiting eternal stasis. This is not defeat. It is completion. We must consider the function of Kiri's narration. She records everything, yet understands nothing. Her voice is calm, unreflective, disturbingly linear. She observes suicides, metamorphoses, and dimensional anomalies without hysteria. Her narration resembles not a survivor's testimony, but a geological record, a flattening of time and emotion that mirrors the spiral's recursive indifference. This choice reframes the narrative entirely. Uzumaki is not a character story. It is a chronicle of irreversible ontological reformatting. The spiral acts less like a curse and more like a non-human intelligence enforcing a geometrical logic incompatible with human narrative. The deeper philosophical implication is clear. Uzumaki is not about madness, mutation, or even death. It is about meaning as a liability. The more the spiral spreads, the less explanatory power human language and memory possess. Direction, history, and individual identity all dissolve into spatial recursion. The spiral is not evil. It is not even animate. It is the presence of too much form, a structure so complete, it nullifies the contingency that makes life human. Lovecraft's Old Ones destabilize the psyche with their scale. Ito's spiral does so with its perfect repetition. The horror lies in the idea that the universe is not chaotic, but overstructured, a prison of curves. Intertextually, Uzumaki is saturated with echoes from earlier horror. The town that cannot be escaped evokes Shirley Jackson's Hill House, 1959, where architecture behaves like a will. The obsessional logic resembles Poe's The Telltale Heart, 1843, where fixations become fatal. But unlike these precursors, Ito's spiral denies resolution. The haunted house becomes the entire town. The obsession becomes environmental law. And the story, true to its title, spirals back on itself. In its final panels, the spiral is revealed to be ancient, a recurring geological event predating humanity. Kuruzucho is not cursed. It is aligned, a focal point in an ongoing cosmic recursion. As we now pivot to our next case study, Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, we must keep one insight in mind. Uzumaki demonstrates that horror is no longer about monsters, but about structures that reorganize reality. In the shimmer of Area X, we will find a different aesthetic, a different tone, but the same underlying question. What happens when human identity collides with an ontological pattern that cannot be explained, escaped, or undone? If Uzumaki presents horror as the inescapable logic of form, Annihilation offers a parallel. Structure, horror as the inescapable disassembly of self in the face of non-human perception. Jeff Vandermeer's 2014 novel, the first in the Southern Reach trilogy, stands at the convergence of environmental dread, ontological rupture, and textual recursion. Framed as the field journal of a nameless biologist, the narrative documents the 12th expedition into Area X, a quarantined, anomalous region whose shimmer marks the threshold between the known world and something else entirely. And yet, from the first sentence, it becomes clear. This is not simply a chronicle of exploration. It is a document of unmaking, an epistemic autopsy recorded by a consciousness already in transition. Unlike Lovecraft's protagonists, who often stumble into forbidden truths, the biologist begins in pursuit of knowledge. She is a scientist, trained to observe without interpretation, and this training becomes both her strength and her vulnerability. Early in the novel, she notes, "Our mission was simple, to continue the government's investigation of the mysteries of Area X. But this simplicity is an illusion. The expedition team, 4 women, stripped of names and referred to only by roles, encounters a landscape where biology, memory, and language are no longer stable categories. The discovery of the tower, a structure embedded in the earth, which she insists is not a tower but a tunnel, initiates the epistemic collapse. Inside its walls grows a fungus-like organism that writes sentences in organic matter, one of which reads, "Where lies the strangling fruit that came from the hand of the sinner? I shall bring forth the seeds of the dead." We must pause here. This sentence, and others like it, are not merely decorative horrors. They are mechanisms of destabilization. The biologist does not react with terror. She reacts with obsession. She returns to read more, even as the words repeat and decay. What Vandermeer constructs here is not a haunted space, but a textual ecosystem, a setting that infects through inscription. The spiral in Uzumaki warps the body through repetition. The shimmer of Area X warps the mind through recursive language. And the deeper the biologist reads, the less her narration resembles a report. She begins to recount memories unbidden, then forgets their sequencing. Time fractures, sentences loop. The journal, which was supposed to capture the world, becomes a mirror of its disintegration. As the story progresses, the biologist's physical body begins to change. After inhaling spores in the tower, she experiences what she calls brightness, a bioluminescent phenomenon that grows inside her, described not as an affliction, but as an awakening. I felt something unfolding within me, she writes, as if I had begun to be rewritten. Unlike typical body horror, where the body is invaded, here the transformation is inwardly accepted. The biologist stops resisting, stops reporting. Her identity shifts from observer to participant in an incomprehensible ecology. This echoes the fate of characters in Uzumaki, but with a crucial distinction. Where Kiri narrates as a witness to the spiral's power, the biologist narrates as a voice dissolving into the shimmer itself. There is a theological structure beneath this transformation. The shimmer resembles an apophatic god, a divine presence defined only by its refusal to be defined. The biologist's journey thus mimics mystical unknowing. But unlike the mystic who ascends into divine union, she descends into ontological recursion. At one point, she discovers her husband's journal, identical in format to her own, detailing an earlier expedition. But his experiences contradict hers. Other journals appear, stacked in impossible quantity. This is not just evidence of prior missions. It is evidence of narrative redundancy. She is not unique. Her thoughts are not original. She is one of many voices caught in an endless cycle of observation, mutation, and narrative collapse. We must recognize the literary technique Vandermeer deploys here. The journal form, traditionally a tool of personal truth, becomes a false refuge. As the biologist continues writing, her sentences grow more fragmented, her conclusions more uncertain. She admits to memory lapses, contradictory emotions, and phantom selves. The journal begins to read her more than she reads it. This circularity echoes the fungal script in the tower, suggesting that Area X is not just a place, but a consciousness, a distributed intelligence that absorbs thought and returns it as altered text. This idea parallels the spiral's role in Uzumaki, where space rewrites perception. In Annihilation, it is the act of writing that completes the shimmer's intrusion. At the end of the novel, the biologist no longer seeks to leave Area X. She no longer defines herself in opposition to it. "I am not returning," she declares, "not willingly, not now, not ever." This is not madness in the clinical sense. It is post-human affirmation. She has become part of a system that transcends human categories. And the journal, once a record of resistance, becomes her final offering to the reader. A text that transmits not information, but contagion. This aligns with the deepest Lovecraftian terror. That knowledge is not cumulative but corrosive, that the act of comprehension dissolves the self. We must ask, is the shimmer evil? Is Area X hostile? Vandermeer refuses such binaries. The shimmer replaces, reflects, recycles. It does not destroy. It restructures. This places Annihilation in direct philosophical lineage with The Color Out of Space, 1927, in which an alien presence warps the land without motive or malice. Yet, Vandermeer deepens the crisis. The color leaves a residue. Area X leaves a copy. Identity is not erased, but cloned into incomprehensibility. This is not apocalypse. It is proliferation without understanding. As we prepare to examine the later expansions and collaborative legacies that extend from Uzumaki and Annihilation, we must hold one principle steady. Both stories refuse finality. They do not resolve, they propagate. And in their propagation, they demonstrate that horror is no longer about closure or revelation. It is about the slow absorption of the self into patterns it cannot perceive, but can no longer escape. horror texts like Uzumaki and Annihilation do not conclude in the traditional sense. They remain unfinished by design, suspended in structures that invite continuation through replication and mutation. It is no coincidence that both stories center around systems that duplicate, infect, and overwrite. What happens after the final panel or last sentence is not narrative closure, but a transfer of pattern from author to reader, from reader to culture. In this way, both Junji Ito's and Jeff Vandermeer's creations have evolved not as static artifacts, but as ongoing collaborative ecosystems, attracting interpretations, adaptations, and philosophical appropriations that extend far beyond their initial media forms. Junji Ito's Uzumaki, while complete in its serialized form, has proven particularly resistant to narrative finality. In 2000, just 1 year after the manga's conclusion, a live-action Japanese film adaptation was released, directed by Higashitsky. Yet the film, while intriguing, fails to capture the slow philosophical dread of the original. It condenses events, exaggerates visual grotesquerie, and attempts to frame the spiral as a curse, imposing intention on a force that, in Ito's world, operates without morality or volition. Critics noted this tonal dissonance. More recently, however, a more faithful expansion has emerged. The upcoming animated adaptation by Production IG, helmed by Uzumaki's own longtime admirers, produced in cooperation with Adult Swim. Scheduled for release after repeated delays, this version promises to preserve Ito's monochrome aesthetic, his pacing, and most importantly, his ontological ambiguity. But expansion is not confined to adaptation. Ito's influence has spiraled outward into fan works, visual art, and independent horror games. The 2015 game World of Horror, a 1-bit roguelike drenched in Lovecraftian tension, includes direct allusions to Uzumaki, with villagers growing snails from their backs and towns that collapse into recursive geometry. These are not simple references, they are re-performances of the spiral logic, decentralized, modular, and ever-expanding. We must recognize that Ito's spiral has become not just a theme, but a mimetic structure, infecting media forms that mirror its pattern of fragmentation and collapse. Vandermeer's Annihilation has followed a similarly recursive trajectory. While the Southern Reach trilogy, Annihilation, Authority, Acceptance, functions as a complete literary arc, it invites interpretive proliferation. Authority and Acceptance do not clarify Area X. They multiply its contradictions, introducing false documents, contradictory timelines, and characters whose identities bleed into one another. If Annihilation was a descent into mutation, the sequels are studies in bureaucratic hallucination, where the institution meant to investigate the anomaly becomes anomalous itself. This recursive doubling mirrors the Shimmer's internal logic. Copy the observer, confuse the record, consume the system. The 2018 film adaptation of Annihilation, directed by Alex Garland, offers yet another expansion, but a complex one. While Garland retains the central themes, identity loss, ecological dread, and incomprehensibility, he transforms the narrative structure into something more cinematic and psychological. Gone is the first-person journal. Instead, we follow Lena, a biologist with a backstory, a face, and a goal. The Shimmer is rendered with stunning visuals, including the infamous Screaming Bear and the abstract doppelganger finale. Yet even here, Garland resists resolution. The final shot suggests replication without certainty, a shimmer carried outward. The medium changes, the method shifts, but the logic of transformation remains. We must pause to consider the implications of these expansions. Both Uzumaki and Annihilation have become platforms for ontological experimentation. They invite readers, viewers, and creators to engage with structures that do not conform to conventional narrative arcs. In doing so, they subvert the idea of authorship itself. There is no single authoritative reading of the spiral. There is no final interpretation of Area X. Each new adaptation, critique, or homage becomes another cell in the larger organism, extending the pattern rather than explaining it. Scholars have also entered this recursive loop. Uzumaki has been examined through the lenses of geomancy, urban decay theory, and Japanese disaster aesthetics, while Annihilation has drawn attention from eco-criticism, feminist posthumanism, and systems theory. In academic discourse, both works function like black holes of meaning. The closer one approaches interpretive clarity, the more language distorts. Consider the work of scholars such as Eugene Thacker, who situates cosmic horror within the realm of the unthinkable world, or Claire Colebrook, who frames posthumanism as the necessity of thinking beyond the human vantage point. Both thinkers could be said to stand within the shimmer or stare down the spiral. Their concepts are echoed by these fictions, even as the fictions refuse to fully articulate them. This reveals something profound. The endurance of Uzumaki and Annihilation lies not in resolution, but in structural indeterminacy. They operate like philosophical machines, generating epistemic discomfort that persists long after the final page or frame. Their expansions, whether cinematic, literary, academic, or mimetic, are not deviations, but recursions. They continue the process these works began. The erosion of interpretive security, the viral spread of ontological dread. In the progression of cosmic horror from literature to culture, a peculiar phenomenon emerges. Some readers do not simply interpret these narratives, they inhabit them. This is not mere fandom or aesthetic admiration. It is ontological participation. When stories like Uzumaki and Annihilation disperse into the cultural bloodstream, they do not remain confined to the shelf or screen. They begin to appear in forums, urban legends, amateur investigations, and whispered hoaxes, suggesting not only that the boundary between fiction and belief is porous, but that these stories were always rehearsals for belief's disintegration. Consider the widespread emergence of what we might call spiral sightings, following Uzumaki's international circulation in the early 2000s. On Reddit, Tumblr, and early image boards, users reported spiral formations appearing in mold patterns, crop circles, or geological shifts after earthquakes. While many of these images were digitally altered or misinterpreted natural phenomena, the intent was not deception. It was ritual performance. The act of documenting a spiral and connecting it to Edo's mythos constituted a form of participatory haunting. One viral thread from 2012 describes a coastal Japanese town that looped back on itself in mapping software, allegedly resembling Kuruzu-cho. The town, which turned out to be a cartographic glitch, became a pilgrimage site for fans and, later, for those convinced the spiral structure was replicating through software. This pattern of fictive intrusion is not limited to Edo's work. Annihilation has inspired a quieter but no less persistent mythos. Area X, though never given a precise location in the novel, is often linked to real-world sites with histories of ecological anomaly or restricted access. The abandoned town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, with its smoldering underground fire, has become one such locus. So too has the zone of alienation surrounding Chernobyl. In online subcultures, photographs of overgrown tunnels, symmetrical moss patterns, or unknown bioluminescent organisms are annotated not as scientific curiosities, but as evidence of shimmer incursion. The implication is subtle, but profound. Fiction has infected perception, and the world is now read through the logic of the story. We must recognize this shift as more than cultural eccentricity. It speaks to a growing ontological instability in the digital age, where the division between symbol and reality is eroding. In the same way that creepypastas like The Backrooms or Slender Man generated real psychological and social effects, the motifs of Uzumaki and Annihilation produce belief-adjacent phenomena. They create zones, not just physical or narrative, but cognitive, where consensus reality frays. In The Myth of Disenchantment, Jason Ananda Josephson's Storm argues that secular modernity never fully expunged the magical worldview. Instead, it relocated it into fiction, subculture, and performance. What we are seeing then is not a resurgence of superstition, but a migration of myth into distributed, post-literate systems. The spiral and the shimmer also function as diagnostic tools for collective anxiety. In the wake of environmental disaster or political instability, patterns emerge. After the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, spiral-shaped debris formations were photographed and shared with captions referencing Uzumaki, not to trivialize, but to name the unnameable. Similarly, in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, Social media posts circulated with side-by-side comparisons of viral structure and Annihilation's refracted cells. In both cases, fictional images served as conceptual prosthetics, ways of glimpsing a catastrophe too vast or non-human to narrate directly. One particularly compelling case comes from a 2017 online ARG, alternate reality game, titled X Protocol, which claimed to be a leaked scientific investigation into a newly discovered anomaly field in the Pacific Northwest. While obviously fictional, its aesthetics closely mirrored Annihilation: field reports, corrupted audio files, descriptions of recursive flora. Participants were asked to solve encoded journals and simulate psychological exposure to pattern entropy. Though the creators never cited Vandermeer directly, the influence was clear, and many players described feelings of persistent unreality after weeks of immersion. This is not a coincidence. Annihilation is not content. It is methodology, and once its pattern is internalized, it rewires perception. We must pause and ask, why do such motifs, spirals, shimmer, zones, lend themselves so easily to belief systems? The answer lies in their structural ambiguity. These are not symbols that point to singular meaning. They are formulas for repetition. The spiral recurs in nature, math, and madness. The shimmer reflects whatever approaches it. Both evade certainty while invoking pattern. In a media-saturated culture where reality is already fragmented, such motifs offer both an explanation and a threat. You are inside the story, and the story is recursive. This reveals something profound. Myth in the 21st century is no longer declared. It is discovered retroactively through alignment, through interpretation, through infection. Uzumaki and Annihilation persist not because their events are believed to be true, but because their structures are believed to be predictive. They offer not prophecy, but pattern recognition algorithms for dread. In this sense, every spiral photo posted online, every Area X rumor whispered on Reddit, is not proof of fiction becoming fact, but of fact dissolving into the aesthetics of fiction. Cosmic horror, by its very nature, resists adaptation. It is a genre grounded in the collapse of sense-making structures, in experiences that lie beyond the limits of visual representation or coherent narration. To translate Uzumaki or Annihilation into film, games, or music, then, is not simply a matter of aesthetic replication. It is a philosophical challenge: how to evoke the unspeakable in mediums obsessed with clarity, motion, and resolution. Yet, despite these limitations, or perhaps because of them, adaptations of these texts have flourished. Not as faithful retellings, but as recursive performances, each one extending the contagion into new sensory regimes. The earliest and perhaps most misunderstood adaptation is the 2000 live-action Uzumaki film, released shortly after the manga's serialization concluded. Directed by Higuchinsky, the film compresses multiple chapters into a single surreal narrative. While visually experimental, featuring Dutch angles, color-saturated spirals, and disorienting edits, it fails to sustain the slow, cumulative dread of the original. The film attempts to make the spiral a villain, a curse, even an antagonist with intention. But in Ito's work, the spiral is not sentient. It is structural inevitability. This misunderstanding dilutes the existential terror, replacing it with conventional horror tropes. And yet, the failure is instructive. It reveals the central difficulty of adapting Ito's horror. It is not about events, but about recursion. And recursion is inherently anti-cinematic. By contrast, the long-anticipated animated adaptation of Uzumaki, produced by Production IG in collaboration with Adult Swim, promises a more faithful transference. Trailers suggest a meticulous reproduction of Ito's stark black and white line work, his slow pacing, and his commitment to atmospheric absurdity. Most importantly, it retains the manga's structure, episodic, gradually collapsing, never resolving. Animation, unlike live action, can maintain the surreal elasticity of the spiral, distorting space and anatomy without anchoring them in physical reality. This new version is not an update, but a ritual reiteration, an attempt to reenact the spiral's incursion in a medium more suited to its ontological ambiguities. Annihilation, on the other hand, received a more high-profile adaptation in 2018, directed by Alex Garland. The film departs significantly from Vandermeer's novel, adding character backstory, interpersonal conflict, and a more linear structure. Yet Garland understands the shimmer not as metaphor, but as pattern amplifier. Visually, the film captures the shimmer's recursive logic, refracted light, duplicated cells, mutated flora. The climax, featuring Lena's encounter with a faceless, mimicking doppelganger, is one of the most unsettling sequences in recent cinema. Its choreography evokes not violence, but mirroring, a dance of becoming. Garland's decision to end with ambiguity, Lena's irises shimmering subtly, preserves the novel's core idea. That identity, once touched by the zone, is forever plural. In video games, where interaction replaces observation, these mythologies find particularly fertile ground. Titles such as Control, 2019, and Signalis, 2022, borrow heavily from both Uzumaki and Annihilation. Control, developed by Remedy Entertainment, places the player inside a bureaucratic facility, unraveling under the influence of a resonance, a sound-based entity that warps architecture and cognition. The game's world is recursive, looping, filled with shifting corridors and documents that read themselves. It is not a direct adaptation, but a thematic transplant, importing the shimmer's logic into an institutional frame. Similarly, Signalis, a survival horror game drenched in dream logic and spiraling timelines, evokes Uzumaki through its looping narrative, grotesque transformations, and ambient despair. In both cases, the game becomes a laboratory of perception, forcing the player to repeat, adapt, and eventually surrender to the system. Even in music, the influence is palpable. Artists like Ben Frost and the soundtrack composer Jeff Barrow, who scored Annihilation, craft sonic landscapes that resist conventional structure. The Annihilation score is especially notable. It begins with acoustic minimalism and gradually becomes unrecognizable, introducing alien textures, atonal feedback, and distorted field recordings. The final sequence, a cacophony of synthetic pulsing and fragmented melody, mirrors the shimmer's effect on language and memory. Listening becomes exposure. Pattern becomes sonic recursion. We must recognize that music, as a non-linguistic medium, is uniquely equipped to simulate epistemic breakdown. The spiral, after all, is not a narrative. It is a waveform. Across these adaptations, we observe a paradox. The further we move from the original texts, the closer we come to their structural essence. Adaptation, in this context, is not dilution. It is transduction. Each medium filters the spiral or shimmer through its own constraints, producing new anomalies. Film literalizes transformation. Games enact repetition. Music evokes dissolution. None of these are definitive. All of them are contagious echoes. And this is precisely the logic of the works themselves. Uzumaki and Annihilation do not want to be interpreted. They want to be reproduced, performed, refracted, iterated. They are not content, but engines. We must consider carefully what this suggests about modern horror. When stories spread across mediums, they usually fragment, each version adapting to market, audience, and technology. But these stories do not fragment. They fuse. The spiral tightens. The shimmer expands. The game plays you. The screen reflects not image, but mimicry. These are not adaptations in the conventional sense. They are recursions, each one not a retelling, but a new entry point into a structure that was always larger than the text. As we turn now to subcultures and academia, we will see that these adaptations are not the end, but merely vector phases, portals into collective cognitive, zones where horror ceases to be a genre and becomes a mode of thought. The question is no longer what the spiral or the shimmer means. The question is, what is it doing to us now? When fiction enters the bloodstream of culture, it mutates. It ceases to be just a story and becomes something else. A reference system, a worldview, a scaffolding for other texts, communities, and rituals. Uzumaki and Annihilation now live as much in academic footnotes and subcultural signal codes as they do in bookstores. This is not the afterlife of narrative. It is its second evolutionary phase, one in which horror ceases to function as isolated spectacle and becomes a method of organizing perception. In this phase, we find scholars, artists, occultists, theorists, and fringe online communities using the spiral and the shimmer not as metaphors, but as diagnostic tools for reality. In the academic world, Annihilation has been particularly generative. Within environmental humanities, it is often treated as a post-human eco-Gothic text, one that dramatizes the impossibility of human comprehension in the face of non-anthropocentric ecosystems. Writers such as Timothy Morton and Stacy Alaimo have framed the shimmer as a site where the boundaries between subject and environment dissolve, mirroring the entanglement of agency and matter in the Anthropocene. Area X becomes not a monster, but a hyper-object, a system too vast in space and time to be fully apprehended, yet one which is viscerally present. In this reading, horror is no longer oppositional. It is ambient, a reminder that the natural world we thought we inhabited has never been human-scaled. Uzumaki, by contrast, has infiltrated discourses of media theory, urban design, and even semiotics. Scholars have noted the manga's strange alignment with Japanese disaster aesthetics and geomantic traditions, particularly in how it represents space as hostile to linear logic. The spiral, they argue, is not merely a shape, it is a spatial syntax, a way of encoding dread into architecture. Media theorists have pointed to Kuruzuchu's recursive layout as a metaphor for algorithmic spaces, feeds, loops, and infinite scrolls. One widely cited paper compares Ito's spiral to the structure of digital interfaces, which invite user immersion through repetition, unpredictability, and dissociation. The idea here is not that Uzumaki predicted the internet, but that the spiral names a pattern we now recognize in everything from Instagram to psychosis. We must pause here. What does it mean that these stories are not only read, but used, as frameworks in academia and ritual alike? Consider the emergence of micro-subcultures around Annihilation, particularly in online forums like Spouse, Reddit, and speculative Discord servers. Members document shimmer zones, places in forests where time feels broken, light refracts oddly, or memories distort. Some groups use the term Area X to refer to non-ordinary environments, abandoned malls, decaying amusement parks, overgrown industrial ruins. These are not merely aesthetic preferences. They are attempts to live within the logic of the text, to treat fiction as a perceptual filter. Similarly, spiral tattoos, once merely ornamental, have become ritual markers for readers who interpret Uzumaki as a text of spiritual surrender. It is not worship. It is ontological alignment. This appropriation is not accidental. Both texts invite interpretation without closure, offering not symbolic clarity, but structural recursion. In doing so, they act as mythogenic machines, devices that generate belief systems without requiring belief. A key example lies in the rise of spiral theory accounts on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, where users link spirals to neurological states, energy fields, and conspiratorial diagrams. Often divorced from Ito's original story, these appropriations still follow its pattern, to name what cannot be explained through shape. Annihilation follows the same course. In subcultural esoterica, the shimmer is sometimes invoked as a metaphor for threshold consciousness, a state between dimensions, between personas, between stable mental states. Academia, too, mirrors this recursive drift. Articles cite Annihilation and Uzumaki, alongside post-structuralist theorists like Deleuze, Derrida, and Baudrillard, not to extract meaning, but to stage epistemic disintegration. One particularly evocative paper refers to Area X as a non-place in the Marc Auger sense, an environment that exists only in transit, never fully present. Another uses Uzumaki as a visual metaphor for the Mobius strip of signification, where meaning doubles back on itself endlessly. These are not casual citations. They are signs that both texts have become vessels for philosophical recursion, ways to embody not just horror, but thought itself under erasure. This reveals something profound. Uzumaki and Annihilation are not simply stories. They are conceptual viruses that adapt to their host environments, whether classroom, forest, or forum. Their success lies not in thematic originality, but in structural versatility. The spiral and the shimmer are not metaphors. They are tools. models for thinking outside inherited categories, for confronting systems without center or edge. In this way, horror merges with methodology, and the genre becomes not a container for fear, but a vector for metaphysical experimentation. Some stories fade once the book is closed, the screen darkens, or the final chord dissolves. Uzumaki and Annihilation are not those stories. They endure, not as memory, but as structure, a framework that alters how the world is seen and thought. After exposure to them, spirals no longer signify mere design, and mirrored landscapes no longer seem stable. More disturbingly, one sense of personal identity, of thought as coherent, of perception as trustworthy, becomes subtly, permanently unmoored. These works do not frighten in the moment. They rearrange perception retroactively, instilling the dread that what we believe to be solid is already compromised. At their psychological core, both texts model what philosopher Eugene Thacker calls horror of philosophy, the realization that thought itself is complicit in its own unraveling. Uzumaki does this through spatial obsession. The spiral begins as motif, becomes contagion, and ultimately reveals itself as the operating principle of reality. No character can escape it, not because it chases them, but because it is already within them, coiled in cochlear, fingerprints, galaxies. The terror here is not external pursuit, but ontological inevitability. And the reader, by tracing the spiral page by page, performs the same circular ritual. The eye follows the pattern. The mind enters the loop. In Annihilation, the shimmer does not destroy the self. It renders it porous. Language decays, memory loops, identity fragments. But unlike conventional horror, there is no antagonist. The shimmer is not malicious. It simply reflects and refracts, much like consciousness itself. This conceptual shift from fearing an enemy to confronting a system invokes philosophical parallels with Spinoza's impersonal God, or with Sartre's nausea, the recognition of existence as groundless, recursive, and self-replicating. To understand Area X is to admit that understanding was never the point, and therein lies the true psychological rupture, not fear of death or madness, but recognition that the self is a temporary lens, not a stable entity. These implications resonate with contemporary psychological discourse. In trauma theory, for instance, the spiral recurs as a metaphor for repetition's compulsion, the return of unresolved affect. Uzumaki literalizes this. Trauma becomes architecture, inheritance, weather. Similarly, the shimmer mirrors the concept of dissociation, wherein identity splinters into mirrored selves, none of which is fully real. Readers who experience anxiety, depersonalization, or obsessive ideation often report that these works do not depict horror so much as recognize it, not from without, but from within. The stories reflect their internal structures, producing not catharsis, but uncanny recognition. We must consider carefully what this suggests about narrative's role in shaping ontological security. Traditionally, stories help us order experience, assigning cause and consequence, establishing stable arcs. Uzumaki and Annihilation refuse this function. They are not stories in the Aristotelian sense. They are recursive matrices, mythological feedback loops in which meaning is neither revealed nor concealed, but dissolved. This dissolving function positions them as philosophical instruments, akin to the Zen koan or the Gnostic gospel, not sources of knowledge, but devices for unknowing. And in the modern world, defined by ecological crisis, informational overload, and identity fragmentation, such devices are no longer optional. They are mirrors of our current psychic state. The spiral and the shimmer, then, are not simply narrative devices. They are models for a world without stable orientation. The spiral is inward, recursive, inevitable. The shimmer is outward, reflective, indifferent. Both dissolve binaries, self and other, subject and environment, real and unreal. Their persistence across media and theory suggests that we are drawn to these forms not because they comfort, but because they echo a suspicion we already hold, that what we call reality is provisional, constructed, and already decaying. They are symbols of the post-human present, where thought is no longer sovereign and perception no longer a guarantee. This reveals something we may not wish to see. Horror in these works is not something we watch happen to others. It is something we participate in through thought itself. Every spiral drawn, every shimmer studied, is a reenactment of our own vulnerability to structure. To see the pattern is to be inside it, and to name it is to risk becoming part of it. We close then, not with resolution, but with recursion. The spiral tightens, the shimmer spreads. Uzumaki loops eternally. Annihilation refracts endlessly. And we, their readers, are left not with answers, but with a lingering reconfiguration of how things fit together, or fail to. This is not an ending, it is a pattern, and the pattern is still unfolding.